Good evening and welcome to our Bugajski Hour special from Washington, D.C. Our guest today is the former National Security Advisor and the Dean of American Grand Strategy, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Welcome to the show, Zbig.
It's nice to be with you.
Thank you again for agreeing to this exclusive interview for Albanian Screen. This is watched by a large number of the Albanian population, not just in Albania, but throughout the region. And first of all, I would say congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
Strategic Vision, which, as we speak, I gather is being translated into Albanian and should be available at your local store or on Amazon fairly soon. And in fact, my questions today will focus primarily some of the major points and issues that you raise in your new book. And to begin with, let me ask you this, because this is of great concern, I think, to a country that's very pro-American, in other words, Albania. And the question is, why will America's global role continue to be essential over the coming decade if, as you say, the center of gravity seems to be shifting from the West to the East?
I think the reason why America's role is going to be, as you put it, essential, I would say important and needed, is that in the absence of an active American involvement in the world, the current shift in the center of gravity of global power from West to East is not likely as of itself to produce stability, but is likely to contribute to the diffusion of power, the dispersal of power, and as a consequence to more political turmoil. Political turmoil in itself is not a good thing because it leads to some conflicts, although I don't anticipate it would produce something like a world war. But political turmoil in the 21st century will have one more very negative consequence. Namely, it will make it impossible for the global community to deal intelligently with the new global problems that we now confront as humanity. And by this I mean a variety of issues, ranging from global warming, to social inequality, to diseases, to overpopulation, and so forth. The 21st century, if we're not careful, could be as dangerous to human well-being as the 20th century was, with its two world wars and the American-Soviet competition, but in a very different way.
Right. You describe it as, at least some of these potential conflicts, as global chaos, quote unquote. And in particular, you focus on what you call the global commons. In other words, that shared space that different powers, and both major and minor, share, and over which there could be conflict. Environment, space, cyberspace. Can you give us some maybe concrete example or scenario that you can see developing whereby a lessened American role could contribute to more instability than otherwise we would have had?
Well, there's a whole set of possibilities, ranging from the Antarctic to simply failure to respond to the issues of global warming, to failure to assist in the development of other states, not to mention much more conventional results of turmoil, namely the intensification of religious, ethnic, territorial conflicts, etc. And of course, there are also some very old-fashioned problems, namely the withdrawal of American power from some parts of the world could produce new attempts by sort of medium-range powers to assert themselves over much weaker powers.
Do you see such a potential problem in Europe with the downsizing of American military presence?
In Europe, I think it will be more a matter of loss of momentum, of confidence, perhaps less effort to move forward with enhanced European unity.
Well, one of the questions you raise in the book, which I found particularly interesting, is we hear a lot about the decline of American power. I think you're a little more subtle about it, but nevertheless quite hard-hitting in areas in which America needs to really focus on to improve its own capabilities. Would you say the United States is waning, if not declining? And the converse side of that question, how can America be revived and renewed?
First of all, I think we have to recognize something which is important to me as a person who's concerned with global geopolitics. Namely, a successful America, successful domestically America, has much greater influence in the world than if it isn't successful, if it isn't perceived as a kind of example of the future, if it isn't associated with people's personal dreams. And I think we have to face the fact in America that many aspects of American society today are stagnating, falling behind others, producing greater social injustice, disparity in incomes, lowered rapidity of social advancement, etc., etc., etc. If we don't deal with these problems, our ability to exercise a constructive global influence will decline, because a great deal of American influence is derived not from the direct application of American power or the ability to mobilize major financial resources, though these two are very important ingredients of power, but also from the fact that many people elsewhere in the world, when thinking of the future, say to themselves, wouldn't it be great if my country became somewhat more like America? And this is why so many people of talent are still attracted to America. But the fact is that in the recent decades, many of the social problems I have mentioned, to which one should also add the element of financial greed, in a financial system that's no longer focused on productivity and therefore on job creation, but on rapid, economically non-productive self-enrichment, these have now really hurt America itself.
Expansion of the financial sector and...
Well, but particularly its non-productive character. That is to say, it really, because of its emphasis on speculation, produces rapid individual wealth unconnected with any positive social consequences. I happen to know some very rich American families, for example, the Rockefellers. Their initiative produced wealth. Yeah. Therefore jobs. Therefore new forms of manufacturing. Look at Ford also, on the whole Ford empire, an example. Today, if we look at the people on Wall Street who in 1 year make hundreds of millions of dollars, which is no longer unusual, occasionally even billions, and certainly making 50 million in 1 year is not unusual. Just the other day, we learned about a major American corporate executive, president of a large company, who gets paid $1 million a day. Where does that money go?
That's almost more than a football player.
Is he investing it in anything productive?
Yeah.
Or is he spending it and his family is spending it on expensive yachts, possessions, etc., etc.?
So what would be your message to Albanians? As you know, many Albanians come to America and they do actually pretty well. They're very entrepreneurial. They go into various businesses. They do much better in many cases.
Well, we need talent like that.
Yeah.
We need talent which comes to this country and innovates with socially positive consequences. Innovation has to have socially positive consequences.
Job creation.
Innovation for the sake of self-enrichment is counterproductive.
Well, one of the things you talk about in your book is the idea of a strategic vision. Do you see that America, given all its problems, given the global problems, has a strategic vision at the moment?
That's why I wrote my book.
And how would you summarize that strategic vision? Why is it lacking in policy circles?
It's lacking because I think in the recent decade or two, we have become preoccupied with the present. We haven't been threatened in a serious fashion the way the Soviet Union threatened us. So we haven't had to look at the bigger picture. Public concern over security was diverted to a side issue, a vastly exaggerated notion of Islamic threat to American security. But most otherwise, the American perspective has been focused on enjoying life, self-enrichment, permissive society, and lack of competitiveness.
Falling behind some of the rising powers.
Yes, particularly Chinese.
I'll come back to China in a second, but I wanted to sort of remain focused a little bit on America and the West. You say somewhere in your book that the unity of the West cannot be taken for granted. What internal and external factors are challenging and undermining this unity, would you say?
Well, first of all, American fatigue and the need to intelligently balance our continuing interests in the Pacific Ocean with our very significant and more immediate interest in retaining close links with Europe. But in Europe itself, there is a certain fatigue with the European idea, inability to translate it into institutional bonding that creates something that is really legitimately entitled to use the word union. One of the paradoxes of recent European history is that the European community was renamed into the European Union, whereas in fact what we have witnessed is the dissolution of the European community into something much less than the Union. Today's European Union is more of a community, whereas the previous European community was more of a union.
Well, as you know, Albania is an aspirant for the European Union. How do you see the future of the European project? I mean, the European Union
project? Well, it depends on the degree to which the Europeans realize that their well-being really demands a Europe that is more unified, able to act with a sense of fiscal and monetary responsibility for the Union as a whole, but also with a political purpose. And one of the things which I urge in my book is a closer cooperation between America and Europe in creating a new balance on the Eurasian continent, because the Eurasian continent is the central arena of global interplay and global conflict. And if there isn't a significant Western presence on it, which balances the new East, we will not be able to act in concert with the East in dealing with the old problems, but increasingly with the important new problems.
Because we hear a lot that as a result of the sovereign debt crisis and many other internal problems that the Union could fracture in the years ahead.
That is precisely the danger, but the response to that has to be the notion, the understanding of something larger ahead of us. Strategizing for the short run is never too successful. You have to strategize for the long run and then feed back into short-range decisions. And one of the things which I advocate in my book, for example, is the deliberate effort to draw Turkey into a much more intimate relationship with the Euro-Atlantic community, even if not necessarily in the short run with the European Union. And I argue that eventually, in the next 2 decades, I think the present episodic phenomenon of Putinism and of Putin himself will be short run, that the fundamentals for the emergence of something that Russia lacks in terms of it being part of the West, namely a constitutional philosophical tradition of freedom, is beginning to be nurtured within the new middle class. Russia otherwise, religiously, culturally, artistically, is part of the West, but never, never, never politically, historically. But that is beginning to be created by the new Russian middle class of relatively middle-aged people and younger who travel abroad by the millions, who study regularly abroad by scores of thousands, who are no longer politically fearful, and they want to be part of the West.
But many don't come back to Russia.
Not that many as compared to how many remain. Yes, there's a brain drain. But nonetheless, look at the demonstrations in Russia. They demonstrate something new, a sense of a confident civic society. Can you imagine, you are a student of Russian affairs, 20, 30, not to mention 40 or 50 years ago, someone going out in the Red Square holding up a placard showing a picture of Putin behind prison bars as a sign of contempt.
That's
and
where you would end up, yeah. At least.
How long would he live under Stalin?
Right.
How long would he be freedom or not free under Brezhnev? Today, people do that because there's now a sense of historical self-confidence which has eliminated a fundamental characteristic of Russian politics, personal fear. That is now gone. And that is something that's very hard to reverse, even for a very sort of would-be autocratic leader like Putin.
So Putinism, as you put it, is do you think, a short-term phenomenon? Nevertheless, it can do some damage to some of the neighboring countries.
In the short run, it can do a lot of damage. For example, he may engage in a stupid pursuit of a Eurasian Union.
Right.
The problem with that idea is, who exactly wants to be in it? Can he name a single country of the former Soviet Union that really is eager to be part of the Eurasian Union?
Voluntarily join.
Maybe Kyrgyzstan, maybe. Not Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, not Karimov in Uzbekistan, certainly not the Ukrainians, even under Yanukovych.
Right.
It's a crazy idea.
Yeah. Let us turn now to the role of China, because you extensively describe the rise of China and projecting how China will become a much more important global player.
Is becoming.
And a competitor, and principal
and
competitor.
Is becoming a competitor.
For the United States. Could you define, in that case, a constructive role between the United States and China in which this competition does not turn to conflict?
Well, it starts with mutual recognition of the reality that at this stage of history, rivalry and particular hostility between them can become self-destructive for both. And that is something new. It's a zero-sum game that is to be avoided. In the past, the rise of Imperial Germany created a collision with Great Britain. Hitlerism with the West and then with America. Soviet Union and Russia for the world. Today, this is very different. Neither of us anymore can be hegemon worldwide. And we have to realize that fact for reasons I've already mentioned to you. It is not possible to do that in our age. So in that context, it should be possible for two intelligent, non-ideologically universalist powers to be able to accommodate. Part of the reason why America and Russia collided, even though in many ways we were similar, large continental societies distant from each other, was the ideological factor on the part of the Russians, which bred an ideological attitude on our part. Now the roles may be a little reversed. We may be a little more ideological than the Chinese, because the Chinese have now really one ideology. It's a country run by a communist party which thinks of only one thing: money.
Right.
And that's a rather non-ideological attitude. And look at the private wealth of many Chinese leaders. In that sense, they are like America, except that we have a little bit of an ideology. We feel that our system of government eventually should be everybody's system of government. That's maybe in the historical long run correct, but it's not going to be promoted by us quickly.
I was going to say, you talk about the civic society factor in Russia, that people are no longer afraid, that there's no longer a single party in control. Do you see that sort of a future for China as well?
Yes, in time, sure. Except much more in time, because the Chinese have an authentic imperial tradition of which they're rightfully proud, and therefore a rather intense nationalism which can be easily aroused. So I think it will take time. But you can't create a middle class of 300 million people, which they now have, the more rich of which travel all over the world and go to the best shops in Paris and Rome and London and New York City to splurge luxuriously and so forth, without that creating then a whole generation of younger people who view that as normal. And therefore feel entitled to more rights, who then create envy from their more immediate associates. This is a new reality which is inescapable.
Whenever I'm in Tirana, I actually see a large Chinese delegation.
I'm not surprised.
Albania and China have always had, did have a good relationship, let's say, in the 60s and
Rather
70s.
peculiar
Under different circumstances,
Rather
of course.
peculiar.
But nevertheless, the links are there. But let's talk a little bit about some of the so-called BRIC powers. You've mentioned Russia, you've mentioned China. How about the role of India in Eurasia?
India is obsessed with China. Just read the Indian press. It's total obsession. It doesn't have the homogeneity of the Chinese. It's a country of multiple religions, ethnic identities, linguistic expressions. China is homogeneous. 94% of the people are Han. China has been a successful state for most of its 6,000 years. India, not really. The Mughal Empire was not India. I don't know whether India in the long run will measure up to the level of China. The Indians are very ambitious. They hope so. They expect so. But I worry that perhaps more likely is some form of conflict between China and India, which could be quite destructive.
Well, let me sort of follow up on that with another interesting question which occurred to me as I was reading your book. The way you describe the West, it's really the northern hemisphere. Do you envisage an increasing gap, as has been mentioned by other analysts, between North and South, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere? And what role can countries such as India and China maybe bridge that gap between these two parallel
Well, I don't
worlds?
think China is really in the Southern Hemisphere. India is more so.
Yeah.
But, you know, the gap may develop. It certainly exists. I think there is a general realization that it's in the interest of global stability that it be narrowed. But it can't be narrowed without the kind of strategic balance, equilibrium, that I talk about in my book, in which the West has a sense of a larger purpose, but it is also a larger West and a more vital West because of Turkey and Russia. And it also requires, in my view, very intelligent stewardship, handling of the American-Chinese relationship by both sides at the same time. And I think on balance, that is happening, but with some growing signs of difficulty. And therefore we have to be alert to the importance of avoiding a head-on collision.
Right. Well, let me ask you one of maybe two more questions, penultimate question. How do you see the difference between yourself as a strategist, grand strategist, and George Kennan and Henry Kissinger?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I would put it this way. Kennan had the idea of containment, which of course many people adopted, but the way they adopted it, Kennan actually disliked, because many people who bought containment, therefore didn't go to war with Russia, emphasized building up of NATO and military power and so forth. Kennan didn't favor that. Kennan thought containment was sufficient by simply ostracizing them and maintaining the line, because they will eventually disintegrate on their own. I think that was a half-truth, and therefore the eventual fall of the Soviet Union was not proof of Kennan's containment. It was proof of something much more than that. Kissinger, you know, he wrote his major dissertation as a graduate student on 1815 Metternich and the grand conservative arrangement for Europe. And when he saw the Soviet Union rising and threatening America, he felt it was time for a kind of grand bargain. We and they, in effect, agree on the status quo. The division of Europe, in effect, division of influence. And leave it at that, freeze the nuclear armaments so each would be secure, but don't meddle in each other's affairs. What I advocated early on was a little bit of both. That is to say, yes, containment, but with reinforcement, so the Russians are not tempted to use power against us. But at the same time, not accept the idea of a clear line and we do not meddle. On the contrary, we meddle, but in a friendly fashion, exploiting the fact that the Russian Empire was multinational and nationalism was vital. And we could gradually separate by embracing the different communist regimes and dealing with them in a normal fashion. We could entice them into more and more self-assertion of independence, national independence, even like Ceausescu in Romania. Better still if it becomes increasingly democratic, as in Poland, with the rise of the Solidarity movement, which said we're not going to leave the Warsaw Pact.
Right.
But I promoted that very deliberately, while at the same time striving to weaken the Soviet Union by supporting national movements in the Soviet Union, very deliberately, as a matter of national policy. And it's interesting to me that Reagan followed much more my views than either the Kennan version or the Kissinger version of grand strategy. And in the end, that did work, in my judgment. The Soviet Union collapsed from internal contradictions, which we deliberately intensified, while being very friendly. And at the same time strong militarily, and even opposing them directly when they went into Afghanistan, to indicate that a foreign policy based on aggression will not work.
As we know, archives from the Soviet Politburo mention you as one of the grand architects of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, I'm flattered. I think that's probably, you know, too kind a statement, but I'll accept that kind of a reward.
Well, let me ask you a very last question. In one of your previous books called Second Chance, you talk about opportunities that will lie ahead for future, presumably the Obama administration, in terms of correcting some of the deficits, some of the mistakes that were made by previous administrations, particularly the Bush senior administration, in terms of foreign policy. Has that second chance been taken?
Not yet. Now, the big question, of course, for the future is, will it be taken in the second Obama term, assuming he's re-elected? That's when he'll have a better chance to do it. I admit that I was somewhat disappointed that he didn't do some of the things which I think could have been done in the first term. But we have to realistically face the fact that he has had a serious problem with the national economy, with the state of the financial system, and with some social issues such as health care, and that the Republicans have become increasingly dogmatic and right-wing, and that also made it more difficult. Once he has his second term, if he has it, he'll be free to do anything he wants.
He doesn't have to be
because
re-elected.
He doesn't have to be re-elected. And I think that will be the test of how far his ideas, his thinking about the world, which I think I know fairly well from conversations with him, how far that can be translated by him into a strategy. We know he's a good thinker. We know he is a wonderful speaker. We don't know yet whether he is strategically determined.
Right.
And that, I think, we'll learn very shortly, if he's re-elected.
On that note, I'd like to thank you very much for this exclusive interview for Albanian Screen.
Delighted to talk to you, and please say hello to my many friends in Tirana,
and I'm
which
sure
I visited it once, and I enjoyed it enormously.
Well, I'm sure you're always welcome to come again.
Thank you.
Sure many of our audience are already lining up, ordering your book.
All right,
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be back in a few minutes with Bugajski Hour. Welcome back to the Albanian Screen studios. We are following that exclusive interview in Washington with Zbigniew Brezezinski, with two leading Albanian analysts here in Tirana, who will enlighten us a little bit more, I think, on the historical and political significance of Zbigniew Brzezinski, both as an academician but also as a policymaker. And I'm happy to have with us today, I'm joined by Remzi Lani and Albert Rakipi, two good friends of mine that I've known for over 20 years. Remzi is the director of the Albanian Media Institute in Tirana, and Albert is director of the Albanian Institute for International Studies. And as I said, I've known Remzi and Albert for over 20 years. We've participated in many conferences together, and they are considered in Washington as two of the leading Albanian political and international affairs analysts. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, let me begin with the sort of bigger picture. Zbigniew Brzezinski is a towering historical figure. He's one of the few, I think, who have successfully combined academia at the highest level with action, with policy making. In other words, academia and action, and the two are quite unique. In other words, he hasn't just interpreted the world as a professor of history of politics, but has actually contributed to changing the world, particularly in the past 30, 40 years. He served, as you know, as National Security Advisor for President Jimmy Carter in the 70s. And since then, he's been extremely active at my institute, at the Center for Strategic International Studies, as an advisor to presidents, as an advisor to various governments, although independent, I must say, of any particular US administration. How would you, sort of looking back at the bigger picture, how would you describe his role in US policy making over the past 30 or 40 years? Not just in the White House, but since he left the White House. Maybe we'll start with you, Remzi.
Yeah, I have had the chance to see him only once in the Riga conference before Riga summit, and actually it was not difficult to realize his influence. When Zbig was talking, everybody was listening and taking notes. Of course, he is one, as you mentioned, one of the most influential American geostrategists of the and statesmen of the last 5 decades. And his name is linked with major events such as the collapse of communism. You know, we cannot talk for the collapse of communism without mentioning his name and his role. Normalization of the relationship with China. It started early, but it was during his time and during President Carter when the U.S. and China established diplomatic relations. The signing of Camp David Accords, very important and actually unique agreement about the Middle East. The financing of Mujahideens in Afghanistan, a very controversial issue actually, very much debated also today. And it happens that he was in the office also during the Islamic revolution in Iran and the crisis of the hostages in the American embassy in Tehran. So, of course, what I mentioned are mostly things related with his role in the office, but in a way he is more influential out of the office with his books, with his writings, with his interviews, and with his voice, and which I think make him unique, in not only in my opinion, but.
Albert, would you want to add anything? What makes him unique? How would you compare him to other American analysts? And is there a European equivalent of Zbigniew Brzezinski?
Well, certainly is a great thinker. Not comparable to anyone else in the States. Even comparing to Kissinger, it's different, it's unique. And of course, first of all, his contribution is related to the thinking on international politics. He developed its own theory on international politics based on geopolitics, which is a bit different from another great thinker, actually, like Kissinger, for example. So, first, the contribution, he contributed to the academia with its own theory. And of course, then he gave a great contribution to the U.S. administration, Carter administration. But at the same time, he gave a great contribution to the academia. I mean, the debate, the thinking about the international politics, and of course, not only with the Carter administration, but with following administrations, including the current one. Another element I think that is, which makes unique for Brezezinski is related to the prediction of things, which is, okay, for example, we have great work of Kissinger, like diplomacy, for example. But if we bring in mind the works, the major works, Brezezinski works, we'll see that he's trying to predict the future. And of course, to change to influence the decision making in Washington, and not only in Washington. This is another element that makes him very different. And of course, I don't see actually, at least for the time being, any other thinker in the States to challenge him in the sense at this level. And of course, I don't see any other from the other regions like Europe, for example, in such prestige and contribution both in academia and decision-making process in international politics.
If I can add something, you know, when you talk for Brezezinski, actually you cannot avoid the comparison with Kissinger, and they are both, you know, both colossus of thinking today. But if I have to mention a difference, in my opinion, I think Kissinger's thought is driven very much by interest.
Realpolitik.
Yes. When it comes to Brzezinski, I think I find a better balance between interest and values. You know, this is why he, in a way, became the champion of the freedom for Eastern Europe, which I think is not that clear in the case of Kissinger.
Right.
Well, sorry if.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the difference, I totally agree with Ramsey that the difference is related to the theoretical thinking, but Brzezinski is different in the sense that he doesn't belong to the power politics like Kissinger. When power is is really, as a primacy, is crucially important, is critical for decision making. So they belong to different schools of thought, international relations, in the theory of international politics. So Kissinger was influenced greatly by Bismarck's statement, Prussian statement, and while Brzezinski was, he developed the geopolitics international. I mean, he's the great contribution, this is my opinion, that should be on the geopolitics. I mean, although of course he was influenced by a British geographer, but however he developed the theory.
Sure.
When
let me jump in very specifically. As you know, documents that came to light after the collapse of the Soviet Union from the Soviet Politburo indicated, not only indicated, but demonstrated that the Russian leadership, the Soviet leadership, considered Zbig to be one of the masterminds of the collapse of communism, the unraveling of the Soviet bloc, the disintegration of the Soviet Union. How would you interpret his role during this particular time, which is a long period?
In this case, I think the Russian leaders were right, because he was one of the most uncompromised politicians or thinkers when it came to the Soviet Union and to the Eastern Bloc, to the communist bloc. It was because of him that the Helsinki process started. Helsinki conference was called. Was, his idea actually, yeah? And the idea of Helsinki was the common Europe, which means engaging East European countries in a process which in the end will bring to the collapse of communism. Contrary to actually foreign minister of that time, state secretary of that time, Cyrus Vance, or other thinkers like Kissinger, he was against the detente, or critical to detente, because in his opinion detente was the status quo. Detente was in the Soviet Union interest to preserve things, not to change things. And documents show that he was one of the people behind or inspiring the Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia.
This is a movement of dissent, for those of you, Albanian audience that doesn't remember, led by Václav Havel and other important Czech dissidents.
Since 60s with Adam Michnik, one of the most famous dissidents in Poland and the Eastern Bloc, a good friend and actually a man who had quite frequent contacts with Pope John Paul II. So all this makes him a figure that the people in the East, I think, owe a lot, because not because he came originally from Poland, but he was really very clear on this aspect. He knew better the Soviet Empire, and
no, I was thinking that the very fact that he was originally, his origin from the eastern part of Europe, from Poland, although it's not the number one, it's not the main drive of the action that the decision, the influence he made to Carter administration to play a different role. Number one is, of course, his thinking. I mean, he makes really important for Carter administration human rights, and I mean, regardless, despite the previous administration or that they emphasized more power and. So I think it was important to a certain extent that the fact that he was from this part of the world. I mean, but certainly then, of course, it was his thinking and the idea to again based on his geopolitical concept of the future.
Yeah, you are right. He was able to predict things. He was able to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union, where not many people or thinkers were predicting that. Later he was the first to one of the first, maybe the first, but for sure one of the first to suggest NATO expansion in East, in our part of the world, which in the early days, after the collapse of communism, still the theory or reminiscence of the zones of influence remain. You know, he took his idea, Eastern Europe, what is called Eastern Europe, has to go to the West, to NATO, and he was one of the first to suggest that. I think.
Precisely. He continues to talk about the expansion
he continues
of the West.
to talk, and
in fact, what I was going to ask you is specifically, he's just published a new book, which we talked about at the interview in Washington, called Strategic Vision. Where do you put this in terms of his work? He's published a series of books. He published, first of all, very serious academic books. But in recent years, he's published a number of policy books, grand strategy books. Where do you place his most recent work in that context? Albert, maybe you?
Well, of course, he gave a great contribution to academia and the thinking and debates on international politics. But as I said from the very beginning, he's not challengeable in the sense that he brought a theory on geopolitics. And I've read a number of books, including the last one. I just started to read it, and still have to finish the reading this book. But
is it available in Albanian, by the way?
It's going to be translated soon.
Yeah.
This is the book.
Yeah.
Well, we bought together, and I just started to read it. Of course, is based on his theory of geopolitics, and he has a great understanding of the changes in today's world. I remember a lecture. It was last year, probably before the book was coming out, when he was talking about changes in the humanity, in the global, at the global scale. And he said that now, for the first time in history, there is a substantial change. You can, today you can kill 1 million people, but you cannot control 1 million people. Before it was completely different. And this was a statement actually which sparked some debates, but he was right in the sense that, because he has the element is that there is a political awakening, awakening of let's say international society.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot control people anymore in the Middle East, in Yemen. We have seen, but he said before the events. I mean, this was the idea that was debating for a long time in the last 4 or 5 years. That nowadays, thanks to technology and other things, you can kill people, but you cannot control anymore. So
it's global awakening, restlessness. That globalization also means that people anywhere in the world can be linked, can communicate with each other, which is a whole new dimension in politics.
I'd like to mention that maybe most of his books are already published in Albanian and translated in Albanian. It will be good that someone takes initiative to have a column, because books are published 10 years ago, 15 years ago, different publishing houses, but his books are in Albanian, and I think also the strategic vision will be published in Albanian soon. You know, if you ask me, the book I like more is the Great Failure. Maybe because
grand failure.
Grand failure.
Yes.
Yeah. Grand failure. Maybe because it's a book about Eastern Europe, communism, collapse of communism. He predicted the failure of Gorbachev reforms and the failure of the collapse of communism. Is a great writing. And he warned also for the post-Cold War euphoria. See, in that aspect, he was quite realistic. Another book which I like more, but this does not mean that is the best, is The Choice, where he puts 2004, I think. Yeah. He puts the dilemma between global domination or global leadership. And he suggests that, being a critic of George W. Bush, he suggests that the way is global leadership based on values and not global domination based on unilateralism. He was against the Iraqi war. Actually, we were in favor, to be realistic.
In retrospect, a lot of people are against.
No, and I think, you know, still I believe that even if the war was a mistake, Albania's choice was right. To
stand by America.
To stand by United States. And in this book, he calls for leadership, not for domination. I think he was right. Another thing I would like to mention is in his what he wrote is few things he commented and wrote on Kosovo war. You know, he was clearly on favor of NATO's intervention in Serbia. He, in several interviews, but also in an article which I published in a book with different
Show the book to the camera.
Different politologs, scholars, thinkers, journalists. You know, it's also an article of yours here, Janusz. And he was in favor of the war intervention, and he was he very clearly said that after intervention, Rambouillet is dead. We cannot go back to Rambouillet proposal. Rambouillet was for a previous stage, but not valid anymore. And Kosovo will be, for some time, a NATO protectorate, sort of NATO protectorate, and later through self-determination, the Kosovo status will be defined. It was very clear position. Not many people were that clear in that moment, including people in the administration. And he disagreed with some people in the administration, Clinton administration, who say that don't talk for the status. No, he was one of the first to talk on the status of Kosovo.
Well, number one, actually I like very much Remzi's idea that we have to publish as not just one single book, but let's say the basic books of him. Yeah? And
the
starting,
works.
Collection. Yes.
It sounds like, well, no, but the idea is that we just got the copyright for strategic vision, and of course, it'd be a very good idea to have 3 or 4 books, and I have in mind, besides strategic vision, ground chessboard, the power and principle probably. So.
Grand chessboard.
The grand chessboard.
Chessboard, yes. And
very important book.
Yeah, very important. And this is number one. Secondly, let me come back to the idea that he gave unparalleled contribution to this theory, to geopolitics actually. Because in the latest book, or in the previous one, the grand chessboard, again, he has a theory that like Balkans of Europe in 20th century, the beginning of 20th century. Now, according to Brzezinski, we have the global Balkans. The global Balkans.
Particularly the Eurasian Balkans.
Eurasia, yeah, exactly. This is, but this region is crucially important, and I subscribe to his theory and is thinking that this is crucially important for the future of the international politics and global leadership. So even in this book, he is reminding us, of course there are a number of ideas and proposals for the policymakers, Washington and other powers in the world, but I think crucially is this understanding of the way of reading the international politics for the future, because as we said, he, differently from the other great thinkers, who are not many actually, he's predicting things, and for example, during the Carter administration, he was trying to shape the events, like in the eastern part of the world.
The strategic vision, the latest book, it's a masterpiece of let's say, futurology in a way, predicting the future, starting from an analysis of what we have today. Like the center of gravity of the world has changed.
But let me jump here, because this is the question I asked him. I mean, one of the things he stresses in the book is, even though America is no longer omnipotent, it's still very important in the world. In other words, America's global role, he believes, continues to be essential over the coming decade, 2 decades. Why, let me ask you sort of from your perspective as analyst, why would a decline in America's global role precipitate or contribute to regional conflicts? Why does America remain important in this sort of increasing multipolar environment?
Yeah, you know, let's start from the Balkans if you want. First of all, I am not really a fan of the term global Balkans. I think Balkans...
it sounds negative, doesn't it?
Sounds negative, because global Balkans go up to Middle East.
His concept is that global Balkans...
I'm not saying that I disagree with the concept, but I am not happy.
Yeah.
And I think from people in the Balkans cannot be happy, because it's like, sounds a bit of you know, reminding people of the negative side of the Balkans. Sure. You know, in the latest book, the basic thesis is that if America will decline, we might enter in a, not in a, let's say, the world will not be the Chinese, but chaotic, kind of Darwinian or Hobbesian world. And I think he's right. If, for example, you know, a decline or a diminished role of the United States in the Balkans. Let's come to our region. In my opinion, a serious balance which exists in the region, serious equilibrium which we have in the region will be broken, will be lost. I call it balance of trust, which means that Albanians, for some good reasons, which we're not going to talk here, trust Americans, and several other Balkan nations, for their reasons, they have special relationships, or they trust more some European powers.
Right.
It's not that Albanians are against them or they are against America, but it's a matter of trust. And even the symbolic presence of United States in the Balkans is crucial to keep this balance. Otherwise, I think, you know, United States, we need US also as a guarantor in our region. So, and we can say the same for the role of United States in Asia, for example.
Sure.
You know, having in mind the China and Japan relationships, bitter history and problematics, or China and India,
sure,
or China, even China and Russia.
Even China and Russia,
yeah,
exactly.
might sound strange that U.S. being a referee between Russia and China, but the only country which can keep the role of a balancer in Asia, it's United States. Another thing is, and I think it's very important, and I fully agree with what Brzezinski says. Brzezinski's message is that, you know, it's the role of United States is not only a matter of military power. It's also a matter of American values, the values of democracy which United States represent. This is why China cannot substitute, replace United States next 20 or 50 years.
Despite its economic dynamism.
Despite its economy. So, and I think he is right that you know, no one is going to win if United States decline. With a weaker America, I don't think that will be many winners, and will be much more losers, I think.
Yeah. We need to stop for a few minutes for an advert break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes.
Very, very briefly on his concept on the global Balkans, because I think it's important in understanding his theory. I mean, the Balkans in 19th century, in the first decade of 20th century, It was because of the Balkans that we had the major confrontation of the major powers in that time. And the idea, the theory is that having a global Balkans, including the Eurasia, without the not dominant role of the United States, but as he used to say, reconciliation as a great power now, not a single superpower, but as a power just to accommodate different.
A power that can balance all the other.
Yeah, to balance the other powers. They are like China, Russia. This is one idea, but then I surprisingly, well, at least we have to read with the books of Brzezinski. You cannot read once and you can fully understand the theory, and so we have to read it again. But when it comes that he suggests that Russia, for example, will be part of the West, which is something that, taking into account the very recent developments in Russia, for example, we have the thinking for the West is first of all related to the values, democracy, rule of law, and
so what he says is, if Russia is to become or remain a global factor, it has to join the West.
It has to join the West
for its own survival as a great power.
For the time being, it sounds like very controversial and not, but well.
He's giving Russia a choice in some respects,
exactly,
I would say. Because as you said, this isn't just looking at the future, it's also giving options for the future.
Yeah, might be, but judging from the time being, I mean,
for the time being, I don't think that.
Well, for the next, at
there
least,
are reasons.
if Putin stays for 6 years, I don't see Russia becoming part of the West.
You know, first of all, Russia is talking for Russian values, which are not our values or your values, you know, our common values. Second, as Ivan Krastev mentioned, Russia sees itself as a 19th century power. You know, Europe is a 21st century power. How can it will be an unhappy marriage or
Europe
impossible?
is a 21st century soft power, I would say, which has
soft
other
power
connotations.
So it will be, for the thinking in Moscow and thinking in Brussels is so different, which I don't think that for some decades we can have a larger West, including Russia. Turkey is a different case.
But probably he's right. Sorry, probably he's right, because he's talking about political awakening. And we have seen in Russia, for the first time, the protest about elections, which is something that we never seen in the first or second term of Putin there. I mean, it's something that is happening there, and we don't know. Might be the end of Putin or Putinization there. We don't know what is going to happen. But
exactly, and the question is, civil society doesn't necessarily always bring democracy to the forefront. If it brings Russian nationalism to the forefront, ethno-nationalism, it could actually be even more damaging, not only for the future of Russia, because of all the many ethnic groups, but also for relations with neighbors. But let me ask you another question, which Zbig does talk about, which is the unity of the West. What factors would you say are undermining that unity? He says it's an essential factor if the West is to remain as a global player, particularly Europe, and that America needs to work with Europe to have more influence globally. What is undermining that unity, that transatlanticism, even unity within Europe?
Yeah, on transatlantic level, I'm not going to repeat Bob Kagan that Europeans are from Venus and Americans are from Mars, but even
there's life on Mars.
Yeah, but first of all, Europe is disunited. Recently I read an article of Disunited States of Europe. Might look a bit cynical or bitter, but something is true on that. First is the economical crisis, creating some divide. Second, if 10 years ago we talked or we heard this theory of new Europe and old Europe, I think this is over now. But now you have a north-south divide in Europe, which is not secret.
Sure.
The thinking in the north of the continent and the thinking in the south, you know, and how we are seeing each other, you know, it's a bit different. You know, how Germans and Scandinavians and Polish see Greeks, Italians, and or Portuguese. You know, it's not a moment of love, I can say, because there are problems. You know, on the different approaches we have towards maybe life or union or I don't know what. Second, what we can see is that, you know, there is in Europe a lot of discourse on European Union, on the common house, but there is more and more tendency of, I cannot say self-isolation, but of going to the self-interest, to the national interest. You see it to British, not only to British, to Sarkozy. You see it to Spanish, you know, Greeks, of course. So there are some fracturas, how is the fractures?
Fractures.
Yes. And what we might see is that Brzezinski actually says that the Germans and Italians might flirt with Russia for commercial and oil interests, that UK can go to the traditional special relationship, which is not secret, with the United States. Turkey will try to create its neo-Ottoman space. Poland would look for its place in Europe because it's a big country, an important country. Spain would look more towards Maghreb and Mediterranean. So I think it's a moment which, in one hand, is interesting, but on the other hand, it's difficult for the West.
Albert, European unity. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, actually, there is no the gap in Atlantic relations. I mean, it's not bigger than let's say 5 or 10 years ago. But the point is that we have developments, very negative developments within the EU. And financial crisis is one thing, actually, which might affect the Eurozone and which might influence negatively the Union. I mean, compared to, let's say, 5 years ago or more, probably, we have a completely different problem now related to the unity, but because of the crisis, because the EU, I mean, political union was ahead, and from the financial point of view, it was a bit early to have a common currency and to have a eurozone, and so it comes because of the not necessarily because of let's say the different countries within the EU are opposing, let's say, the foreign policy of current U.S. administration. But it comes because they seem that they have their own agenda. They have to survive, to recover the Union from the crisis now. So I see from this point of view that might affect the unity of the West. And Brzezinski is talking about the enlargement of the West.
Precisely, but he also warns about the possibility, I mean, of disunity making Europe less of an important partner for the United States in the future. He talks about this partnership, but it's important for Europe to maintain its cohesion, for that partnership to work. I have one last question. Unfortunately, we're beginning to run out of time. Do you see on the horizon any figures of Brzezinski's stature, either in the United States or in Europe? Any figures emerging either from academia or from the world of policy?
You know, I'm not sure that, you know, we really can judge, but you know, we try to follow, and of course, you know, there are very interesting scholars and very interesting political analysts, but to tell you the truth, I don't see people with the same stature as Brzezinski or Kissinger. You know, we read and we publish here and we comment several authors from Fareed Zakaria to Bob Kagan, you know, and others like Joseph Nye and or Fukuyama, But you know, in my opinion, you know, I don't see in US and I don't see at all in Europe actually, where of course there are very interesting scholars, writers, like one Dominique Moissy, for example. It's a brilliant,
French.
brilliant expert on international affairs.
The French professor of international relations.
Sure.
But you know, to my opinion, it will take time to have such a profile like Brzezinski.
Well, the Brezezinski came out of the great events like, I mean, the Cold War was a huge development, crucial, important development in the last 100 years. And this is one reason. But then, I don't see, if there is nobody is emerging in the States, I don't think that somebody will show up in Europe, for example. And I'm saying because the competition, the possibility in the States is different. It's different compared to Europe.
Yeah.
But, well, I think that Brzezinski was the product of his time. In the great times, communism was in place, Cold War.
Big times produce big people.
Yes. And we have to wait and see, but actually, Ramsey mentioned Fukuyama. He's a political scientist. He's wonderful in what he proposed to read, for example, how the human international society was developed and the institutions and the state, specifically the state, was developed. But again, they are far from the developing a theory in one side and the other one to try to shape the events as a policy, to influence the policy making decision, and to predict the future. I don't see currently any figure
in
like
Europe. What we have in Europe is actually we are short of political leaders. There is no real leadership in Europe in the big European countries. So they think up to next elections.
On that note, let us finish, because that's a subject maybe for another show in the future. But thank you very much, Ramsey and Albert, for a very open, stimulating discussion on what I think is one of the major, if not the major, American analysts and policymakers of the past half century. Thank you both for being with me. And thanks to our viewers for tuning into this special presentation. If you missed any part of the show, you can view it in its entirety tomorrow, including the interview. I will be back very soon on Albanian Screen with Bugajski Hour. So good night, everyone. Stay healthy, be productive, and remain optimistic. Miro Pavshim.